Thank you for joining us today. The webinar will begin in approximately 1 minute. Welcome to RCR Wireless News. I'm Martha DeGrasse, and our topic today is wireless infrastructure services companies. I'd like to introduce you to your panelists for today. Analyst Aaron Blazer is VP at Atlantic ACM. Aaron, thank you very much for being here today.
Thank you for having me.
Paul Harris is here. He is President of Global Network Recruiters of Blackhawk. Paul, thanks a lot for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, Martha. Appreciate it.
And also here is Mark Bolick. He is VP of Product and Marketing at Bluestream Professional Services. Mark, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
And I'm Martha DeGrasse, editor at RCR Wireless News. RCR Wireless News is a premier news source for the wireless communications industry. We're a leading provider of carrier network, handset, and telecom software news. Follow us online at rcrwireless.com and on Twitter at RCR Wireless News. I'd also like to direct your attention to an RCR Wireless News feature report on wireless infrastructure services. Key takeaways from this report include the fact that carriers are building connections with new contractors and resources to help meet the growing demand for wireless infrastructure. And carriers continue to favor contractors that can self-perform. That means less subcontracting and more accountability from contractors. Contractors with strong local connections and an ability to tightly manage the supply chain do have an advantage. And the Tier 1 carriers are starting to move from coverage projects to capacity projects, and we'll talk a little bit more about that today. Right now, I'd like to jump right into our first topic. Mark, you are right in the thick of the wireless infrastructure services industry, and I'd like to hear your perspective on how the growing demand for towers and cell sites is impacting your business.
Yeah, it's a great question. Thanks. As I've got responsibility for both our logistics business and services business strategy, which is Bluestream, and I could see it impacting us from both sides of those business. On the services side, which you referenced, heavy demand for a lot of the skill sets that are needed to deploy these networks: RF engineering, tower climbers, DAS and small cell installation crews. So we've really been in ramp mode for the last couple of years to keep up with the demand, and the demand has been pretty steady for the most part. On the logistics side, it's even more interesting as you start to take products, technology deeper into the supply chains, closer to the consumer. A lot of the supply chain models that have been used in the telecom industry for years are not as effective. So we've been working with both the services side of our business and logistics to design some fairly unique supply chain solutions to address that, and we'll probably get a chance to discuss that later on.
Yeah, we are going to talk a lot about the supply chain later on. And then what about prices paid for the crews that are actually doing the work? Paul, you recruit these crews and the people that manage them. Do you see prices of paid to tower crews and contractors rising?
Well, I guess the quick answer, Martha, is, heck yes, absolutely. Obviously, tower crew guys have been the most popular guys in the world for the past, 2-3 years. I've always made the joke when I'm at a trade show, I could probably start a riot by going in the middle of the trade show floor and yelling, "I have tower crews." So yeah, they're definitely definitely in demand. But in general, we recruit a lot of directors and VPs and above, et cetera, as well. And just in general, it's been a crazy, wonderful ride for us here in the recruiting world, in the wireless infrastructure space. It's just been definitely going well. But in the spirit of me always shooting straight and just telling you the truth, I would say there's also a bit of a dichotomy in terms of, back to your compensation question, Martha, a bit of a dichotomy in the fact that, we're clearly out of a recession, but I would say that companies are still kind of feeling that sting from the recession, and so they have what I call a recessionary mindset in a post-recessionary environment. So said in a different way, and of course very respectfully to all the companies that hire people out there, they're more than a bit picky, and then they should be, right? This is their money they're spending and not my money, and they need to make these good decisions. So you got that aspect of it, and you also, I would say, it's further exacerbated by M&A activity that have left rock stars, right? Incredibly qualified, high-level individuals out there looking for work. So from a supply and demand perspective, it's kind of put a little damper, a little muffler on the compensation.
Right. We have seen some consolidation in this space. I know Nokia is in the process of buying SAC, and I think Jacobs bought a company earlier this year as well, and Mostec bought Dynas. So there has been consolidation, and we may see more of that ahead. Now, tower crews are not the only resources. Obviously, you've got your site acquisition specialists, your network architecture engineers. Do you see demand for those types of specialties also being pushed higher, or is it mostly the tower crews where there's just that intensity?
Well, no. It's all over the board. I mean, if you go to any of the trade shows, BCIA and CTIA and UTC and all you can hear about is just what a great ride it's been for coming up on 3 years. So yeah, there's a lot of demand. I mean, there's demand for salespeople, high level director, VP level people that go to AT&T, Verizon, Sprint, TMobile, and say, hey, let us build some cell sites or do upgrades from 3G to 4G, LTE, UMTS, etc. So yeah, I mean, I don't say that I can't just say, Martha, it's just tower crews. I mean, tower crews are probably the most popular and the most visible in terms of press and whatnot, but yeah, it's all up the chain from tower crews to VPs and executive VPs, engineering, operations, sales, everything.
Okay, all right, good to know. And just before we leave this topic, Paul, and I'd like to hear from the others as well, on the site acquisition point, I'm curious about whether that process is changing at all as we all recognize the increasing mobile data demand. I think some of these communities that may have fought against having towers in them are perhaps relenting a little bit as they realize how much they need and want the coverage. Mark, you might have an insight on that.
Yeah, and at Bluestream, we outsource site acquisition to some of our partners, but the demand is pretty substantial, and it's become more and more critical to turning sites up quicker. I was in a conference with a large carrier not very long ago where they had a major strategic initiative to reduce their cycle time in the site acquisition area down from several days to just 2. I think 48 hours was their target, and that's pretty substantial. But I think what that tells us is they need to go faster to create more capacity in the site acquisition arena. So there are a lot of site act companies out there, and you've mentioned a couple that have even been part of the M&A activity. But it is becoming much more, I think, critical and focused than maybe it has been in the past.
Okay, all right, good to know. And Aaron, do you have anything to add on that?
Yeah, I think the way we're seeing the network evolve in our work as an advisor to carriers and infrastructure owners and infrastructure deployers is we're seeing everything get more and more localized, and even on a micro level, when you think about the future and small cells in outdoor networks, the search rings become tighter and tighter and tighter for where you can put these things as you densify and increase capacity on the network. So local is very much and very important, more so than it ever has been, and will only localized attention will only get more and more important over the coming years as these networks continue to grow and expand.
Yeah, it's interesting. It seems to me that the carriers are favoring larger contractors, but they want these contractors to have very finite local resources. So I think it's interesting. So let's move on and talk about the carriers and their different approaches to the contracting process. Aaron, I think that you could probably do a really good job of sort of giving us a bird's eye view of the AT&T turf contract process.
Yeah, so that great segue here. From an overall perspective, AT&T, in allocating how it goes about deploying infrastructure, has a sort of master contracting turf vendor program, where it hires primary contractors for given sections of the country where it's deploying network. And this has been with Turf 2.0 requirements starting in 2011, and they had contracts that were announced then. With a number of providers to different sectors of the country, and then those providers are put in position to deploy within that part of the country. We have seen some consolidation among those providers and seen some shifts in those providers based on performance, and we're looking for another evolution of this program to begin later at the end of 2014. So more in tow for how this will evolve as the network deployment needs change, but the model remains relatively the same.
So new turf contractors probably being announced late this year or early 2015?
Yep. Yes.
And these companies then do subcontract work to a lot of other companies that are in the space, right?
Yeah, I mean, you see some large national ones that have big stretches like a Goodman or a Black & Veatch that are in multiple regions across the country, and they do have localized assets, but they also don't do everything that's required for various deployments. So they definitely subcontract on a region-by-region basis to support their deployments and things that they're doing along the way.
Okay, great, thanks. And Mark, you're involved in this process. I know that you're working for AT&T right now. Can you tell us a little bit about your role in the TCAP program?
Sure. And Bluestream has experience several years with turf programs at AT&T. We're one of the larger central office turfs, mobility data centers, DAS and small cells. So we're familiar with the process. And in the tower crew world, it's very similar to the legacy turf programs. I'd say they got to get a little bit more specific due to the size and scale of that deployment. Now, the TCAP program was specifically designed by AT&T to help improve. One of the things Paul was talking about earlier is tower crews in the industry in general. And while there are quite a few tower crew companies, obviously there's a capacity or a shortage of overall tower climbers. So TCAP was designed to split AT&T's region up into three specific regions: West, Midwest, and East. And Bluestream has the Midwest. And we maintain a capacity of tower climbers that is. We work very closely with AT&T to manage, and you mentioned partners and subcontracting before. We subcontract those crews to AT&T's existing turfs, and I think Aaron mentioned a few of those turfs. So we have pretty strong partnerships within what would typically be a competitor in our world. There's partnerships there to help subcontract tower crews and make sure AT&T stays on track with their build.
Okay, so that's interesting. And those tower crews, do they have to be dedicated for AT&T, or can they work for somebody else if AT&T doesn't need them?
Yeah, we have a certain percentage of them that are dedicated to AT&T. That was an agreement as part of TCAP. I'll say not all of them, but we do dedicate a certain percentage to AT&T. So the primary value to them is to maintain that capacity in the industry.
Right, because it is tight. Okay, thanks. And Paul, I know that you help, again, place a lot of the people that are managing the deployment of these resources. So tell us a little bit about the AT&T turf vendor situation from your point of view.
Well, it's, I think that Mark did a great job of kind of describing Aaron, about what they do. So it's my understanding that there's basically it's broken down into into 5 regions, and within region there's certain broken up into different markets. So there's 5 regions, 32 markets, and there are from between 1 to upward as high as 6 vendors per market, and then the regions are dominated by the kind of tier 1 folks, I would call them. So the Northeast, I would put it more in the Bechtel category. Midwest, Southwest would be the Goodmans and the Black & Veatches of the world. Southeast, pretty much dominated by MasTec. And then the West is a little bit more diversified in terms of, Bechtel and Black & Veatch, Ericsson, and then also West Tower. And the other thing that that I think that people would find interesting is that AT&T has a scorecard, right? That's got 6 different metrics that they measure these guys on, and they, they drive a pretty hard bargain, and I say that respectfully, right? They want their stuff done right, and I respect that. So they rate their guys, and that's how they decide who they're going to go with and who gets more jobs, etc.
So let's talk about some of those metrics. Staying on budget, staying on schedule, are those the types of things you're talking about?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, there's 6 different metrics, and I can bore you with them, but it's basically all around managing how well do you do your job, right? How well do you manage the project?
Okay, great. Well, that's actually a good segue into talking about Verizon, the other giant, because I have heard that Verizon also manages key metrics like budget and schedule and safety and quality very tightly, but does it differently at a much more localized level. And Aaron, can you start us off by giving us an overview of the way actually that Verizon and T-Mobile both operate in a more local way?
Yeah, I think when you look at the space and infrastructure deployments in general at Verizon, there's a very localized approach that they take, and they rely on network deployment teams and network managers within 21 set regions within the U.S. So they're looking at things, everything from site deployment all the way to backhaul networks, all within these localized regions, and they allow a fair amount of autonomy between the regions to function and pursue more different strategic ends, but all getting obviously to that network performance at the end of the day and that high level of network density that they're known for. So at the beginning of the day, though, there's a lot of autonomy when it comes to the region and how the region works and who the region uses from a vendor perspective. So there's a lot of that localized concentration, and that allows them to have been a leader in some of the things they've done on the infrastructure front and how they've gone about deploying things.
Okay, great. And can you give a little bit of information about T-Mobile's approach? I know less about that.
Yeah, T-Mobile similarly T-Mobile kind of has a national-local approach. They do radiate a lot from the national level, but they also have then localized teams from a deployment perspective, so it's not as autonomous as Verizon. So it's somewhere in between the AT&T and Verizon view from an overview there.
Okay, terrific. Thank you. And then Sprint, as we know, is going through some changes right now, but traditionally I understand that Sprint has worked through the OEMs like Ericsson and Alcatel-Lucent, and they have operated as almost what a turf vendor would be for AT&T. They have managed crews and other companies for Sprint, but now I believe that Sprint is moving more towards working directly with the companies that are on the ground doing the work and vetting their contractors more closely. And Paul, I think that you have confirmed that and that you have worked with some of these people, and I'd like to hear your perspective about what's going on with Sprint right now.
Sure, Martha. Yeah, so I think everybody knows that Sprint's outsourced network vision to Ericsson, ALU, and Samsung for their 39,000 sites, and then outsourced Spark to ALU, Samsung, and NSN. And gosh, how do I say this respectfully? Things have not gone as well as Sprint or any of us would have hoped in terms of their network build. And I think there's a shift definitely to to the contractors, the vendors, etc. And I think there's another element that's weighing in on this, Martha, and that is that the new regime at Sprint with the Clearwire background, I think that is more of a Clearwire mindset and methodology of how to do business, kind of going direct versus outsourcing to the OEM. So kind of a more mid-range model.
Yeah, and I would think that with the new CEO that might even accelerate.
Yeah, I would think so, and I think it gives some interesting, shall we say, dynamics in terms of if you're a vendor that was working for an OEM on the Sprint project and now you're a vendor working directly with Sprint, bypassing the OEM that you used to work for. So kind of some goofy dynamics, I'm sure, with that. It'd be interesting to be a fly on the wall in those conversations, right?
Yeah, I think it would. All right, thanks. Let's move on and talk a little bit about some of the shifts in spending that have gone on this year in particular. And Paul, I know that you have been directly impacted by some of the ups and downs with AT&T. I think most of us know that AT&T did pull back somewhat this spring, but what are you seeing now, Paul? Do you think things are starting to pick up or not yet?
Well, there's no question that there was a slowdown, and I must say that anybody who's affected by that, my heart certainly goes out to them. But in my world, I guess we've been so busy, recruiting that some positions have been put on hold, but in general, we're still cranking. But I think the thing that we need to remember is that we've seen this before. We know what the story ends up like. This temporary before, it's going to be temporary in this case, and I don't think any of us on the phone here can imagine that AT&T is going to sit around for too long letting Sprint and T-Mobile gain ground on them, much less, of course, Verizon. And then I think we've talked about the pressure to build, right? I mean, this data tsunami or data explosion or whatever it's called is not going away. It's only getting worse. I was talking to a guy the other day that was saying to me, "Hey, Paul, we just turned up an AT&T site and it was virtually at capacity the second we turned it up." So I think they have to be aggressive. They've committed $9.2 billion for the second half of the year. So, Martha, you and I have talked about this before. It's more of a speed bump than a stop sign. I think that and people are continuing to do work. It may be under a deferred invoicing model, as it's called, where you can't bill AT&T till the first of the year. But yeah, I think it's going to be for a little while. It's going to still be, the water's going to be cranked down a little bit. But in 2015, I think the water's going to be turned on. It's going to be a wonderful ride again for all of us.
I would expect so. And even now, I think there's a lot going on. Mark, I'd like to get your perspective not only on AT&T, but also on T-Mobile. We've heard that T-Mobile has been very, very active during the first part of the year, and I'd like to know about what you're hearing there.
Yeah, so just to touch on AT&T briefly, I think
yeah.
nailed it. Lot going on there. I think they publicly announced a lot of what their plans were for the year, and there was a bit of a slowdown for a while, but we expect it to finish strong, and all indications are that they're going to do exactly what they said they were going to do. So I think that's good news for most of the services companies out there in the industry, and really the suppliers as well. From a T-Mobile perspective, interested in perspective here from the other panelists, and I think Aaron talked about it a little bit earlier. They announced some pretty aggressive initiatives last year, and I think they're continuing into this year. From a services perspective, what we see as a provider to them is a lot of DAS and small cell type activity, more on the DAS side. We don't have a relationship with them on the tower side. But, one technology that people don't typically associate with wireless right out of the gate is data center, but we're seeing a lot of data center activity too. So all that traffic and data has to be stored somewhere. So to us, that's an indication that T-Mobile's programs are moving forward just as they publicly stated, and we're looking forward to more opportunity. Their DAS program is very similar to some of the other carriers out there.
Is it mostly indoor DAS or outdoor DAS that you're working on?
Most of what we've seen today is indoor, and I would say that's not just specific to T-Mobile. That's across the board.
Okay, thanks. Well, I guess we can't talk about T-Mobile without talking about price wars, and so I would like to hear everyone's perspective really on whether the price wars that we've seen and now continue to see with Sprint can or would hurt network spending in the rest of the year. Aaron, I bet you have a perspective on that.
Yeah, I think what we're seeing from a price perspective, I mean, Sprint obviously announced their new pricing plan earlier this week, and we're seeing other carriers, been playing on these pricing games over the past year and a half, 2 years or so. But I think one of the things that we can tell pretty easily from what's happened from a subscriber perspective is that if you don't have a great network in place, no matter what you do from a pricing play perspective, you're not going to be able to win back subs among those top 4 postpaid providers. So I don't think in the long run or in the short run you're going to see network spending drop off as a result of these price plays. I do think you are going to see carriers look for shifting between CapEx and OpEx models when it comes to how different pieces of the network are deployed and different pieces of the network are managed. So one of the things that we've seen pretty consistently or for the past year and a half, 2 years or so on the backhaul side of things is carriers have looked to rein in high-capacity cell sites and cell sites that are seeing more capacity growth, and move from a lit service model to a dark fiber model at a cell site so that they can control that potential for ongoing operating expense increase with increased capacity needs at a given cell site. So we are seeing things like that happen. We're also beginning to see some optimizations in sort of the costs of managing the network on an ongoing basis. But all in, if you're a carrier and you drop your price and you don't have the network experience, you're not going to be able to win those subs. So really having a network that's on parity with the others, if not better than the others, is paramount to any price that you're going to bring to market in the postpaid world.
Yeah, it's non-negotiable. I think you're right. And Mark, I'm interested, are you seeing more reliance on dark fiber?
Well, you know, we've heard, we've been involved a little bit in it. Bluestream does not get that heavily involved in it because it's a subcontracted service for us, but we're seeing a lot more carriers, especially with small cell, that are having to rely on dark fiber. We'll usually turn them to a dark fiber provider, but we have seen a bit of an increase in it recently.
Okay, great. All right, and then I'd like to talk a little bit about the shift from coverage to capacity. I think that is probably going on more with AT&T and Verizon at this point than with anybody else. But how does that impact your business, Mark, as the carriers really focus on densifying their network and creating the coverage that we all need as opposed to building new sites?
Yeah, it's interesting. It's a good, healthy debate. I think the pendulum seems to have shifted, and it does shift back and forth between the two. I would say that today it's shifted a little towards more capacity. Now that the backhaul has been built, how do you get traffic off of that as quick as possible and make that more efficient? So from the capacity perspective, the DAS demand is up. We are seeing a bit of small cell, maybe not as aggressive as originally planned. I don't think that's related to intention. It's more related to technology adoption and definition. But there's still some coverage stuff going out there. Rural wireless is coverage-based. A lot of the outdoor DAS is coverage-based. But if you notice what you're seeing on TV with the commercials, they used to be a lot of commercials with maps, with color-coded maps of the coverage. Now they're on TV talking more about DAS and small cell and more capacity-based technology. So for us, tower crews, DAS small cell crews, RF engineering, that shift back and forth really, it stays pretty stable for us from a business perspective.
Okay, all right, great, thank you. Okay, and then when we talked a little bit earlier about the importance of being able to self-perform, but Mark, I know that's something that you've talked to me about in the past, and given that the carriers do need to really understand local resources intimately, the concentration on big contractors who can manage everything would almost seem to be at odds with that. Can you talk a little bit about how that all works?
Yeah, we've mentioned TCAP earlier, and one of the big requirements that AT&T pushed in the TCAP program and continues to push is self-perform. And it comes down to accountability. And I think we've all talked about the number of tower crews and tower climbers that are out there in the industry. It really not just limited to tower, but really any services-based business that is out there. As many people that you have touching the network, as many processes that these large carriers have, the quality that they have to maintain, the ability to have one company that can provide it all in certain areas, and that's a lot of what you see in the TURF program as well, and the direction it's headed, is accountability, reducing the moving parts. But I will say, as much as there's a drive towards self-perform, it's still an industry of partnerships, so very few companies can do every single activity required. You might have a tower company that needs SIDAC help, or you might have DAS and small cell installation company that needs RF engineering help. So a lot of drive towards self-perform, but a lot of partnerships still exist between the companies out there, and I think that will continue to be the case in general as we move forward.
Yeah, and it's come up before in this conversation that some of the same companies that compete on one front may work together on another front. So I think that's a little bit about what you're saying here as well.
Absolutely.
And Aaron, can you take us on a little bit to talking just about maybe more from a financial perspective, the benefits of scale and the way that may or may not drive more consolidation in this industry?
Yeah, I mean, I think we've seen a fair amount of consolidation over the last sort of 3 to 4 years. You've seen Mass Tech obviously play in that. You've also seen Nokia coming in with for SAC wireless. I mean, that scale really leaves you less from a financial perspective. The scale leaves you less vulnerable to single carrier plays. A lot of the smaller turf folks tend to be could be one carrier centric, where from a financial perspective, if you're 80% rooted in AT&T or 90% rooted in AT&T or even 60, it leaves you highly vulnerable. So some of these scaled players that can draw on, while it's a small ecosystem of four, can build more of a diversified business, and that this business can be more of a diversified piece of an overall construction or deployment-oriented business at the end of the day. So you do see that scale coming into play, creating less volatility in the overall ability to manage the business on an ongoing basis. It's just an easier way of bringing a business to market, just like in any other industry.
So do you think we'll see more consolidation?
I do think there is room for more consolidation. I think there are definitely more folks looking for a more diverse base of customers at the sort of mid to small level end, and up market. I think you will see some continued consolidation as well of what we've seen in the last couple of years.
Okay, thanks. I would like to mention that we will hopefully have time for a couple of audience questions at the end of our webinar. So if you have a question, please use the question tab on your GoToMeeting control panel, and we will take a look at those and try to answer one or two of them at the end. And now we're going to move on to talking about logistics. Mark, this is very much your area, and I've heard from other people as well that managing logistics and the supply chain in particular is, of course, a huge value add. So maybe you can talk a little bit about how that works when you're dealing with so many moving parts.
Yeah, I'll say that the models are changing rapidly from what a lot of us in this industry knew as the standard telecom distribution or supply chain models. And a lot of it has to do, the network is getting more complex. It's getting closer to the consumer. It really has to. So whereas in the past there might have been these nice, big, environmentally controlled distribution centers throughout the country, and a lot of the product was kept there, that doesn't really, it's not as efficient and effective when you need to have product on a site, and these sites are spread out all over the place. So really it requires a lot of collaboration that maybe did not have to exist before. Not that it didn't in some cases, but the carrier, the OEM or the supplier, the contractor, and now the distributor is playing a much bigger role than I think they have in the past in bringing some of these unique supply chain models into the market. You know, there were several times this year when some of the ramps we've talked about, the suppliers were having trouble with the scale of the ramp, and you would have tower crews sitting at towers ready to go, but no antennas there, for example. And I think a lot of the people in the industry are familiar with that. So we're working with a lot of these contractors and carriers in the industry to try to figure out how do we do a merge and transit solution where there's product coming in from all different angles, and you consolidate it and get it directly to the tower, kind of a menu, so to speak. So when those crews or installers show up, it's there. It's not sitting in a warehouse and they have to manage it themselves. Direct to site is another example where we're trying to get product closer. It's closer to the consumer, closer to the job site, so it reduces the complexity of material management. But it really is changing the game, and I think we'll see it continue to change as these technologies move deeper and deeper into the network.
Okay, great. And that does speak again to being in touch with local contexts and connections, and you've spoken about that, so has Aaron. But Paul, I'd like to hear your perspective. Do you get a lot of requests for individuals that know a certain locality very well, or that can really operate within a certain geography?
Oh my gosh, yes, absolutely, Martha. It's absolutely huge. I mean, I don't know if I could emphasize it enough. So remember I talked about a little bit earlier about companies are, shall we say, discerning in terms of kind of who they do business with and who they hire and et cetera. I use the word picky, I think it was. The bottom line is there are, like I said, still that recessionary mindset. I think they're really looking for that quick ROI. So somebody who's I would call it like a known commodity in a market, so someone who's very well connected, already has the big thumbs up from AT&T, Verizon, Sprint, T-Mobile, or the OEMs or the tower companies or something like that. It's absolutely huge for the vendor. So these folks can not only bring them more work, but they just can get things done faster. They know the shortcuts, they know the market, they know the players, the local go-to guys, et cetera, where the bodies are buried, et cetera. So I think the old saying that comes to mind is it's not what you know, it's who you know. Definitely applies in a situation like this. And Martha, from a recruiting perspective, I mean, we actually coach our candidates before they go into an interview with someone to, don't be shy in terms of telling them who you know and, who would say great things about you, etc. And it's many times the thing that tips the scale for them in terms of them getting to go ahead for the next interview or just getting the job offer.
Right. So those connections could not be more important. Okay, great. Well, I think that we should talk a little bit about climber safety. It's definitely an issue that's been getting a lot of attention, and for good reason. I know that there were, I think, 13 deaths last year, and that the FCC and OSHA are both looking at this issue, and that NATE has convened the Wireless Industry Safety Task Force, and they are doing some great work. So it seems like things are moving in a really positive direction, and yet we have still seen some more accidents this year. And as people that that work directly with companies that are deploying crews, I'd like to get your opinions, starting with you, Mark.
Okay. Yeah, it is a very sensitive topic, and as fast as we're going with the tower climber industry and with some of the deployments the carriers are having, safety is a big concern, and I'll tell you it's a heavy focus too. I don't believe some of the issues we're seeing out there are lack of focus on safety. I think it's related to the speed, and there's really two things. There are these structures themselves, which many of them are several years old, and then there's the skill and experience of the climbers, and with the number of people coming into this industry every day, you have to keep up with that sheer number of people, and the training programs have gotten extremely sophisticated. You mentioned NATE, which has a very strong certification program, and here at Bluestream, when we created our tower program, we created our own tower training program, but NATE was with us every step of the way to help develop that. OSHA obviously is very heavily involved, and we haven't had any major issues, thank goodness, but I think a lot of what happens is on the job site, the urgency to get a job done and maybe lose focus. The technology is changing, so the ability to audit these jobs on site is becoming more critical. I think it's less about the training that's happening in the training centers, because I think that's very robust today. Maybe couldn't have said that 2 years ago, but I could say today the training is very good. It's exactly how it's being executed at the job site, and we're extremely focused on that as well.
Right, and also I think the ability to audit the contractors themselves. I know that Sprint has hired PICS Auditing to vet all its contractors, and nobody can work for Sprint on a job site without being vetted by this independent auditor, and I think that's probably a good move, and something that will take some of the best practices from maybe other construction industries and bring them to wireless a little bit. Now, one thing that I wanted to ask you also about, Mark, that relates to safety, and you mentioned technology changing and new equipment, and I know that a lot of towers are getting a lot more equipment on top of them, and maybe they're not quite ready to support all that equipment. Do you see that as a driver of some of these safety concerns?
Yeah, I think what you've seen, and maybe I can lean on some of the other folks as well, they probably have a broader knowledge, but we have seen, we do require, and I think the carriers do as well that we work with, an audit of the site itself before anybody gets on the tower. And there's much heavier equipment. Driving lighter cables and connectors and some of the smaller ancillary items on the tower. The active components, the technology, there's more of it up there. So while the individual unit might be lighter weight, the overall amount of material on the tower is driving that weight up. So there is a requirement to go out and audit these sites to make sure they're safe prior to anyone getting on the tower today.
Okay, great. Thank you. Now, Aaron, Paul, do y'all have anything to add on the tower structural integrity and how that can impact safety? Okay. Paul, I'd like to get your perspective on anything else that you're hearing from the companies that you talk to about promoting best practices when it comes to safety.
Sure, Martha, and I will say that I think Mark did a great job of kind of laying it out there. I do know, and Martha, you mentioned this, right? The Industry Safety Task Force, and we mentioned NATE, so just make sure that everybody knows that that's a National Association of Tower Erectors. And so this task force is led by NATE, and it's got, you know, the big four wireless carriers and the tower companies and some, you know, the tower, you know, ATC, Crown Castle, SBA, et cetera, and then also some of the vendors. And I think it's all about raising awareness and doing the training courses. And I know that they've got a public service announcement, a PSA, regarding 100% tie-off 24/7, I think it's called, and there's a video on that. They're kind of hoping it's going to go viral. But the bottom line is just, you know, no free climbing, it's the law, et cetera. And I was talking to Todd Schleckaway from NATE the other day, and he said they were coming up with a national wireless training standard with a curriculum and third-party certification and et cetera. So third-party certification meaning not the training companies are giving certification, but a third party that's doing that. I also know Jonathan Adelstein from PCIA, so the president and CEO of PCIA, is working with OSHA and the FCC, and they've got a meeting coming up on that. And then there's the punitive aspect, right? So in other words, the people supposedly are going to get fired if they don't tie off, and then there's some, you know, kind of maybe slap on the wrist type of stuff, kind of controversial fines that are being levied to the companies. And I think there's a lot of controversy around that, so it'll be interesting to see where that goes. And I think Mark talked about the, you know, things moving to the top of the tower mounted radios, et cetera. So it just makes things slower for these guys, and it's just the itch to be careless or to fudge or to go faster, et cetera. And free climb is always going to be there. I think the key is just to make sure that the people, the guy on the ground or the woman on the ground who's in charge of the crews, are going to be making sure that they hold them accountable to tying off 100% of the time.
Right, and also empowering those climbers to advocate for themselves if there's ever a problem.
Exactly.
All right, thank you. So let's move on to HetNets, and we've talked a little bit about DAS already, but Paul and Mark, I think that you both have some good perspective here. Really, we've all had something to say about DAS, but Mark, you shared a little bit with us about demand from T-Mobile. What else are you seeing with DAS?
Yeah, demand remains pretty strong, and there have been quite a few large-scale, what we might call Tier 1 DAS deployments out there, a lot of stadiums that get very high profile, but there's still a pretty significant coverage and capacity issue, especially in these venues. And there's been a lot of buzz around small cell. I'll say that small cell has a future, and I think we're going to talk about that in a minute, but DAS is certainly still going very strong. Most of what we see is indoor or in-building DAS. I would hope that Bluestream's purchase of Tempest DAS assets a couple of weeks ago was an indication of how we feel about DAS, and we're seeing pretty strong demand on our supply chain and logistics business as well. So there's still, you know, when you talk about hospitals, more on the enterprise side as well, hospitals, federal government, health, education, large venues, there's still quite a bit of demand for DAS, and we expect it to continue to grow.
Okay, great, thank you. And let's update anyone who doesn't know that your company did purchase DAS assets from Tempest, including key personnel coming over, and that's going to really strengthen, I think, your commitment to DAS, right?
Sure. As a matter of fact, I'm in Atlanta this week in that integration period, and we've got a lot of those folks in town. We're excited about it. It does add a lot of subject matter expertise to our organization, and should help us achieve a lot of the growth objectives we have around there. We're excited about DAS.
Okay, great. Now, Paul, are you seeing a lot of job openings for DAS-specific positions?
You know, absolutely we are. I was at DAS and Small Cell Congress, and boy, that was an excited group of people, right? I was talking to people about the AT&T slowdown at DAS and Small Cell Congress, and they were kind of like, "What slowdown? We have no idea what you're talking about," basically. So yeah, that world is going well. And one of the things that a quote that I remember, Martha, you probably remember it from PCIA, and I can't remember who the speaker was, but basically they were talking about AT&T, Verizon, Sprint, T-Mobile saying on TV, hey, we've got 300 million LTE pops covered, or 280 or 250 or et cetera. And the quote was basically, yeah, but that's basically a mile wide, but only an inch deep. So basically the focus was, hey, we need to do this fill-in and densification with the DAS and small cell. It was mentioned by what Bill Smith mentioned as one of his top three at PCIA, and then at DAS and Small Cell Congress, both Paula Dublin from AT&T ASG and Scott Simone from Verizon talked a lot about, hey, this is kind of where we need to play and focus. So yeah, a lot of uptick in that area.
And we should distinguish between indoor and outdoor. Aaron, I know that you talk to service providers about both. Are you seeing more demand for indoor, or is outdoor getting strong as well?
Well, I think where you see the industry today, the indoor versus outdoor is a pretty significant distinction in what's happening. I mean, indoor, as was reiterated earlier, continues to go gangbusters. It's much easier to make the economic distinctions and the economic business case for indoor deployments all around when it comes down to it, as you have that confined building. We're seeing indoor move at a rapid clip in not just sort of your traditional avenues, but also in your tall, shiny office towers, as large enterprises are looking at these solutions for boosting coverage on their indoor facilities. On the outdoor side of things, we're seeing it as an augment. We are seeing players like Crown Castle push the strategy with their acquisition of NextG a couple of years ago. You're seeing that play a role in their outdoor densification strategies that they're putting out there for a couple of operators. We heard Verizon at a recent equity conference talk about some of their outdoor DAS deployments that they're doing within major metros to boost coverage from an outdoor network perspective. So I think the outdoor market is very minor in comparison to what's going on in the indoor space, but we are seeing it play a role in the evolution of the ecosystem, as outdoor, from both a DAS and small cell perspective, is very rapidly evolving, but still at the very infant stages.
Okay, great. And what about small cell projects? Are you seeing more of those?
I think small cell can be classified, you use the baseball analogy, is really in the spring training or early days of the draft or minor leagues. I mean, we really don't have a set deployment strategy among any of the carriers out there today. We see a lot of testing and a lot of work to really figure out the economic models and how to make the economic models work from an equipment, backhaul, site acquisition perspective. These are very different than deploying macro cells, and from a cost perspective, getting those costs in line for these very scaled deployments of small cells is something that we've seen as a barrier towards really large-scale deployments. It's something that we believe will happen in the very long term, but it's not something that's happening today. We think things are coming in line for some scaled deployments mid-2015, late 2015, rolling into 2016. In the pipeline, but really not playing a major role in the ecosystem today.
Right, and it seems like we've been hearing for a while that it's in the pipeline, What do you think, Mark? Is it finally going to happen next year?
I would agree with what Aaron said. There was a lot of press, a lot of big numbers shared. I think a year ago, if we all sat on the phone and talked about what small cell was or asked the question, you'd probably get 5 or 10 different answers. There's a little more clarity coming into the conversation, but it's still very much an unknown. We have completed a few small cell trials for some carriers. I think what small cell is challenged with today is high volume deployment. Exactly what is the definition of small cell, and what are the best practices for deploying it in high volume? So, 2015, I think it grows, but is it going to hit? Is it going to be deployed in any type of scale in 2015? I'm a little skeptical of that. I think we'll see growth, but I think it's still got a couple of years to mature.
Okay, good. And Mark, while you're talking, I realized from the audience questions that I did not define TCAP. That's the Tower Crew Augmentation Program that you're part of. So I think that name sort of explains what the program is. It's to augment the tower crews for the turf vendors. So I apologize for not explaining that earlier on. Finally, we need to talk about Wi-Fi, and I think that carriers are starting to understand that Wi-Fi is complementary, not competitive, to their coverage ambitions. Aaron, I know that you have looked at this and thought about this. Do you think that we're going to see carriers looking specifically for Wi-Fi expertise as they deploy their infrastructure?
Yeah, I mean, look, the interesting thing about Wi-Fi that's commonly missed out there in the market, I think if you look at some of the statistics Cisco puts out, like about 70% of wireless data traffic is consumed over Wi-Fi today. And so Wi-Fi plays a huge role in the ecosystem from an offloading perspective, whether it be your home Wi-Fi network or what we're seeing with the cable companies actively deploying Wi-Fi throughout the U.S. within their metro markets. The vast majority of that deployment is coming more so on the home set-top box side of things than real significant metro Wi-Fi deployments managed by the cable operators. But they're looking at it as a way for them to play within the wireless ecosystem and really have a role in that wireless ecosystem. So I think cable has played a strong card in the Wi-Fi space, and we'll continue to see it play a role. And I think it's more of an augment to the existing mobile networks out there when you think about it. One of the things that we see on an ongoing basis is an issue with Wi-Fi as a replacement is those handoffs between the Wi-Fi network that you're on to the cellular network on. Wi-Fi is not ubiquitous coverage, whereas the cellular network tends to be more ubiquitous. So the minute you go to move off of Wi-Fi, making that handoff to that cellular network tends to still be problematic. Now there are folks that are working hard on that, but I think that's one of those stumbling blocks that we see for Wi-Fi to play a bigger role in the mobile ecosystem out there today.
Okay, great. Mark, are you getting involved with Wi-Fi at all?
Not a lot.
Not a lot. Okay.
Very few right now.
Okay, all right. Well, we are about out of time. We do have one audience question, and if nobody wants to take it, we'll try to email the individual. But there is a question about outsourcing power infrastructure, procuring power. I thought that was more of an issue maybe in some overseas markets and less in the U.S. But does anybody on the panel have anything to say about power infrastructure? Okay, well, we will try to get back to that person offline. So thank you very much. And I'd like to thank everybody for being here today. Aaron Blazer, analyst and VP at Atlantic ACM. Aaron, we really appreciate all your comments today.
Thank you.
Paul Harris, Global Network Recruiters of Blackhawk. It was great to have you here, and we really appreciated your help. Thank you very much.
My pleasure, Martha. It was fun. Thanks for having me.
It was fun. And Mark Bolick, we are glad that you made it through the bad weather. I know that you're in the middle of some of that right now, so we're glad that you stuck with us. Bluestream Professional Services, thanks very much for being part of the webinar.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Hopefully none of the sound effects in the background distracted anyone, so thanks a lot.
Thank you. Thank you very much for joining us, and this will conclude the webinar.